Welcome back, everybody, to another exciting edition of Western Civilization. Today, we're going to be looking at late antiquity from the years 400 to 732 AD. So grab a pen, a paper, a tablet, and a keyboard, and let's begin. By the end of this lecture, you will be able to analyze the key factors that led to the fall and fragmentation of the Western Roman Empire, emphasizing the interactions between Rome and the Germanic peoples, explain how Byzantium preserved Roman political and cultural traditions while evolving into a distinctly Greek Christian empire, evaluate the causes and significance of Islamic expansion considering both internal religious unity, military tactics, and external factors, Byzantine and Persian exhaustion. Compare and contrast how Latin Christendom, Byzantium, and the Islamic Caliphate each adapted and transformed Rome's legacy into unique civilizations. And finally, assess how Islamic dominance of the Mediterranean reshaped economic and cultural relationships, isolating Western Europe and influencing its later medieval developments. In earlier lectures, we've already seen how the Roman Empire had changed in very profound ways. Under Diocletian in the late 200s and early 300s, the imperial system had become centralized and turned into a more authoritarian, monarchical-like system. We saw that Diocletian had divided the empire into different administrative units, with the east-west divide being the major one. We saw how his efforts to persecute Christianity had in fact backfired and led to his successor, Constantine, converting to Christianity and legalizing it. We saw that Constantine had moved the empire's capital to a new city of Constantinople far to the east, and how the central locus of Roman power had already shifted significantly eastward. We saw that how at the Council of Nicaea, Constantine had empowered the Christian bishops to become important players in the political system itself. In this lecture, we're going to look at the permanent fracturing of the Roman Empire. We are going to see the fall of the Western Empire and see how it is going to be overrun by barbarians. We are going to see Byzantine cling on, the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire survive but cling on barely in the face of a new power, and that new power is going to be Islam. And what we're going to see is this Mediterranean world break apart into different regions in different parts. We are going to start our story with the fall of the Western Empire. And we are going to have to know the protagonists in this story, namely the Germanic peoples. Not only because they are going to be one of the primary catalysts of the fall of the Roman Empire, but also because their culture and their institutions are going to play a large role in shaping medieval Latin Western culture. The Germans themselves originated from southern Scandinavia and northern Germany, and they slowly began to migrate south around 500 BC, eventually running into the Romans, who were in the process of extending their empire northwards. Eventually, a rough border along the Rhine and Danube River began to form, and the two groups largely settled in to their respective locations. A little bit about Germanic culture. The Germans were not a united people at this time. They were tribal war band-like societies, kin-based societies, if you will. Um, they were usually led by some sort of a chieftain, and these chieftains were followed a pattern that was very similar in other Indo-European societies, where the chief is both a war leader, a judge, and a priest in some ways. Now, unlike an organized monarchy, these chieftains were leaders, but they weren't absolute rulers or anything. They would have had a group of warriors that they would surround themselves with. This was called a comitas structure, I believe by the Romans. I think it's a Latin word. The comitas, these were the war band. And these people, these warriors, would bind themselves to each other and to their leader by an oath of honor in some form of a gift exchange. Not to give too much away, but we're going to see this in particular evolving into some of the medieval institutions of vassalage and lordship later, but we'll hold off on that. For those familiar with stories like Beowulf, heroic traditions were popular among these tribes. These tended to be oral because at this stage the Germanic peoples were largely illiterate. And so they would preserve their group's values through books like this. Economically, the Germanic peoples at this time were agrarian, living in small villages, but not yet cities. A big part of the economy and a big part of someone's wealth was measured in cattle. And so cattle plundering and even plundering of slave plundering was a pastime among these peoples. And so they didn't have a monetary economy just yet. Now, as I said, for centuries, the border between these peoples in the Roman Empire had been the Rhine River here in the west and the Danube River in the east. And the Germans would live along this line here. Now, for centuries, by the 300s AD, they had interacted with the Romans. Sometimes this was hostile, and there would be cross-border wars between one of these or several of these groups and the Romans. But a lot of times it wasn't that way. It was amicable, so there would be trade, there would be intermarriage, and especially military service. The Romans were always looking for new people to fight in their army, and oftentimes they would employ Germans to serve as soldiers in the army. Also, the Romans were allied with different tribal groups. They would ally themselves with some of these border groups, and these were known as federates, or barbarian allies. And these people would guard the border on behalf of the Romans. And so there was quite a bit of cross-cultural exchange here. And the Germans themselves began to absorb a lot of Roman ideas. And so already by the late 300s, most of them were Christianized to one degree or another. Many of them adopted Roman military titles, and they began to use Roman administrative models. And so the Germans weren't static. They were moving toward some level of sophistication themselves. And so the question may be, why did this state of balance, what tipped it? Well, the answer is out here and to the east. And this is the Huns, who I want to look at next. The Huns originated on the Eurasian steppe. This is an area of vast grassland made up primarily of nomadic herders and horsemen. For the most part, throughout most of human history, these are warlike peoples, but too disorganized to really threaten larger, more settled civilizations. But periodically throughout history, both before the time of the Roman Empire and afterwards, the nomadic peoples would get a charismatic leader. They would unite together and just descend on one civilization or another on horseback. They would come out seemingly out of nowhere. They would come in massive numbers. Um, they were fierce warrior people, and it would just completely either overwhelm or severely disrupt a civilization. So it had happened several times already, and this was one of those scenarios under a charismatic leader called Attila. Attila would lead the Huns into the west. There's some thought that the Huns may have actually emerged on the Chinese border, and for various reasons migrated west. And so what started to happen is the Huns began to push into the west. And in between the Huns and the Romans were these Germanic peoples. And so the Huns would raid into the territories of these Germans, who themselves were warlike. But this gives you a sense of how powerful the Hunnish threat was. And they began to push the Germans into the Roman Empire. And so the Germans were essentially caught between a rock and a hard place. One was the Huns, who were absolutely lethal. The other was to take your chances at pushing into the Roman Empire. And so that's what began to happen. It was like a domino effect. And many of these tribes began to cross the borders. And so the Franks or the Visigoths or the Ostrogoths or the Vandals or any number of tribes began to push into the Roman uh, land. Not so much as an invasion at first, but more like a refugee crisis, which got out of hand. Many of these tribes had already had relations with the Romans, and the Romans tried to do their best to accommodate them to some degree or to use it to their advantage. But they were really overwhelmed by all of this. And what eventually is going to happen is it's going to get out of hand, and the barbarians are going to begin to raid and essentially form their own autonomous areas within the Roman Empire. And so Rome ends up, the capital city of Rome, or the former capital of city of Rome, I guess we should say, ends up getting sacked for the first time in 410 under the Goths. In 455, it's sacked again, and worse, under the Visigoths. And finally, there is still a Western Roman Empire, emperor, although he's much weakened. Finally, in the year 476, the last of the Roman emperors, a man by the name of Romulus Augustus, is deposed by a barbarian king by the name of Odoacer. And this is usually listed as the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. But again, it's a centuries-long process. The first Goths began to cross into Rome in 376, and this took 100 years until Romulus Augustus is deposed. Now, oftentimes in older histories, this is marked as the beginning of like the Dark Ages. But more recent histories have reevaluated this. First of all, it did mean the end of anything like a central government in the Western Empire. So there was not going to be a Western Roman emperor anymore. But many of these tribes that came in weren't necessarily interested in destroying Rome, as kind of carving out their little place within it. And so their position in it wasn't as destroyers, but many of the tribes just set up their own chieftain as like a king within this, what had been the empire. All right. And, some of the names of these tribes you might be familiar with. Some of them are going to leave their mark. And so the Visigoths are going to move into Spain. The Ostrogoths are going to move into Italy. The Franks move into Gaul, which soon becomes France after the Franks. The Angles and the Saxons move into England, and so England is named after the Angles. And so you get this fracturing of sorts of the West. The Latin language is still going to prevail in various forms. As the empire breaks down and regional dialects begin to take over, the Latin language begins to morph into the Romance languages that we know today. Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, French, and Romanian. And become these languages over time. Also, Latin is still going to be the language used by the church, which doesn't fall. And as you may remember, Roman governors and Roman emperors might be gone, but Constantine had placed bishops in high-ranking positions throughout the empire. And so these bishops are going to act as local rulers in many places, right? So the barbarians weren't interested in almost all cases in destroying the church. They usually tried to cooperate with the church. And so these bishops are going to act as local governors, or sometimes when there is no local government, because the barbarians weren't much interested in living in cities, these bishops would act as local rulers. And so between the barbarian tribes themselves and the church, Roman tradition were going to carry on in one form or another. Many of the kings would adopt Roman titles. For instance, in the Middle Ages, we often hear about dukes. That comes from the Latin word dux, which means leader. And so we're going to end up with like a blended tradition of Germanic and Roman traditions politically. And these barbarian tribal groups are, as I said, are going to lay the foundation for many of the future medieval kingdoms. So again, I want to just emphasize that this wasn't the hostile takeover that it has sometimes been portrayed as. So much for the West, but what about the East? We haven't spoken much about that. And the Eastern Roman Empire is going to survive largely intact. And this is going to be for a variety of reasons. So while the West is going to be fragmented, the East is largely going to retain its shape. And one was the invasion routes. There were less barbarian invasion routes. The East was wealthier. The East was more urbanized. Remember, civilization had largely moved from east to west and not the other way around. So most people, even at the height of Rome, would have lived in the East, and they would have been wealthier in the East. Also, Constantinople was wisely constructed and had strong defenses, and so it was never seriously threatened. And so the East is also going to benefit from being more centralized, having a stronger tax system that's able to pay for armies and defense. And so the East is going to continue largely the way it had under Constantine or Diocletian. It's going to maintain Roman institutions. It's going to maintain its army. It's going to maintain its bureaucracy. The Byzantines, as we'll soon be calling them, that's the confusing part. So the Eastern Empire is going to become known as the Byzantine Empire, if I hadn't already said that. I use them interchangeably. So they're still going to identify themselves as Romans. They're, right up until their end, which is going to come in 1,000 years, they're going to say we're the Roman Empire. And even though they're going to gradually shift to speaking Greek, since Greek is the majority language in the East, so the government will become a Greek-speaking government, they're going to say we're Romans. The Christian religion, orthodoxy, that was defined at the Council of Nicaea under Constantine, that's going to be the state ideology. And what we're going to see is a gradual divergence from East and West. So while the West slips into barbarism, the Byzantine Empire is going to maintain its institutions and to see itself increasingly distinct. They're not going to see these barbarian kingdoms as their equals or really having much to do with them. Linguistically, they're going to be increasingly divided as the Byzantines adopt Greek. And increasingly, even though they're going to share the same religion, there's going to be a divide, even religiously, between the way Western Christians do things and the way Eastern Christians do things. And so really, there is a division that is beginning to form. Now, there was one last play at reuniting the Roman Empire, and this came under the most famous of Byzantine emperors, and that is Justinian. Justinian he ruled from 527 to 565, and he was a very powerful emperor. Now, it's important to remember, he starts ruling just 50 years or so after the last Western Roman emperor was deposed. And so there was, we know now that the Roman Empire was never resurrected, but there was nothing to really say that it couldn't be. You'll remember it had fractured before. And so what Justinian is going to attempt to do is he's going to attempt to recreate the Roman Empire by conquering various parts from the barbarian kingdoms. And so he's initially pretty successful. He sweeps into North Africa, driving out the Vandals who had settled there. He goes into southern Spain. He wages a very, very brutal and costly war in Italy against the Ostrogoths, but is eventually able to drive them out. Although, as we'll see, it'll be short term. Justinian's also known for the Corpus Juris Civilis, or the body of civil law, which was going to become the foundation for not only Byzantine law, but later on many medieval and even early modern law systems, basically taking all this Roman law and recreating it. He's really famous for his construction. The guy did like to spend money. And one of his most impressive achievements is the Hagia Sophia, which is this massive basilica in the middle of Constantinople, just a testament to the late Roman engineering. And, this was maybe the crowning achievement of Byzantine civilization archaeologically. A very impressive structure and very impressive achievements, but very costly. Not only in terms of money, but also in terms of manpower. Justinian's conquests and his building projects really overextended Rome and its resources. Justinian was also unlucky that that the empire was subject to bubonic plague in 541, which weakened the population and economy further. And his gains were largely reversed within decades. The Byzantine Empire was also beset with outside challenges. The Sassanid Empire reemerged as a threat during these years, and both sides, the Romans and the Sassanids, fought some pretty brutal, grueling wars in the late 500s. The Slavs and Avars, barbarian groups, began to migrate into the Balkans, severing it from the empire. And to make matters worse, there was a lot of religious disunity. Ever since the Council of Nicaea, when an official version of Christianity was determined, many people who identified as Christians across the empire did not subscribe to it. And many of these people were strongest in places like Syria and places like Egypt. So to sum things up, the Byzantine Empire in the late 500s was broke, besieged to some degree, and religiously disunited, and this was a bad time for it to be so because it was about to experience its greatest threat. And this threat wasn't going to come from the Slavs, it wasn't going to come from the Persians, but it was going to come from seemingly out of nowhere, on the fringes, by the Arab tribes. We're going to turn now to the rise of Islam. But before we do, we should examine the situation in Arabia prior to its rise. The Arabian tribes, Arabia itself is a largely desert-like land. It has a few oases, a few small towns or cities. During the Roman Empire, and even before, this area was an important trade route connecting places like India to the Mediterranean. Camel caravans would go across these deserts. Cities or towns like Mecca and Medina were important trade stops along the way. But the area was largely tribal. Arabia was a patchwork of different tribes. And these tribes would often fight amongst themselves. They would dispute over wells and water rights, which are obviously important in a desert environment. They would fight over trade routes, and they would generally checkmate each other pretty continuously. One of the tribes, the Qurayshi, over here, were a particularly significant tribe because they were the guardians of Mecca. Mecca was not only an important trade route, but an important religious location. Mecca was the home of an important religious shrine called the Kaaba, which is like a black cube. In pre-Islamic times, the Kaaba was allegedly filled with different idols. Allegedly, there are 365 idols, one for each day of the year. Arab tribes from all over Arabia would come to Mecca and pay homage at the Kaaba. And so for the Qurayshi tribe that were the guardians of this was a very prestigious thing to be in charge of. It's into this world that Muhammad was born. Muhammad was born into a trading family, and for the first 40 years of his life, he seemed to have lived a pretty standard merchant life, traveling along with the caravans. The area of Arabia had recently seen an influx of Jews and Christians, many of them fleeing the persecution that they were experiencing in the Byzantine Empire. Muhammad seems to have been interested in many of the stories and many of the theological disputes among these groups. Around the age of 40, Muhammad claims that he began to have visions. And in these visions, the angel Gabriel would come to him and tell him to recite. At first perplexed, Muhammad began to recite, and he began to recite in verse. And this would happen periodically over the next several decades for Muhammad. He would get a vision and be told to recite and recite some verse. Later on, these verses would be collected by Muhammad's followers. Muhammad himself was illiterate and couldn't read, but some of his followers began to collect these verses, and they became the foundation for the Islamic holy book, the Quran. This began in around the year 610 AD. The main emphasis of the Quran and of Islam in general is monotheism. Muhammad claimed that there was one God and that his name was Allah. And so the word Islam means surrender to this God, Allah. And Muslims are the surrendered ones, those who have surrendered to this God. Along with monotheism, there's a strong social justice element, a strict code of piety, and other things we find in monotheistic religions. Muhammad began to share his revelations at first with close friends and family, some of whom converted over to his teachings. But in general, he began to face hostility in Mecca. The Qurayshi tribe was none too happy to have Muhammad denigrating their gods, and worried that he might interrupt the pilgrimages to the Kaaba. And so Muhammad was forced to flee to Medina. This became known as the Hijra. And it's an important element. Hijra means flight. And it was at Medina that Muhammad really began to get a community around him. And in Islam, the Islamic community of Muslims is called the Ummah. It just means community. Over time, the Ummah began to expand in Medina. Some Arab tribes came over to him, but he still faced disputes with Mecca and eventually went to war against the city of his birth. Muhammad was able to defeat the Meccans, I believe in 630 AD, and was able to clean out the Kaaba of all the idols, and he rededicated it as a shrine to Allah, which it still functions as today. Just 2 years later, Muhammad died, which created a potential crisis because Muhammad was not just a spiritual leader, but he was also a political leader. And the solution was to nominate a successor, or a caliph. So sometimes we call this the caliphate. A caliph is the religious and political authority in early Islam. Kind of like king and pope in one. Before Muhammad's death, though, he had united virtually all of the Arab tribes for the first time in history. And as we're going to see, this would have pretty profound effects. Under the caliphs, the tribes of Arabia, now united by this monotheistic faith and motivated by promises of reward, began to wage jihad against external enemies. So whereas the Arab tribes had always fought, now their energies were finally directed outward instead of inward, using very effective military tactics like cavalry warfare and rapid mobilization. The armies of Islam began to penetrate into some of these older civilizations, namely the Persians and the Byzantines over here and over here. At an amazing speed, they were able to crush the Persian Empire and peel off large sections of the Byzantine Empire, really some of its richest and most important provinces, namely North Africa, Egypt, and Syria. Remember, Egypt and Mesopotamia are the two ancient river valley civilizations and were massively wealthy provinces for the Romans and later Byzantines. It's important to note that the Persians and Byzantines were both coming off an exhausting warfare against each other. Both were suffering under plague and under loss of manpower because of war, and were also both broke. The Arab armies were very united, and the Arab warriors were fearless because they were promised rewards in heaven. And so with this motivation, they began to spread out and made it as far as Spain by 711. So if we think about it, Muhammad dies in 630. By 711, they've knocked out one of the great ancient empires, the Persians, and peeled away 3/4 of the Byzantine possessions. Islam was going to become a new superpower. It was going to be by far the largest and the most united of the successors of Rome. Arabic was going to become the new lingua franca of trade across North Africa, throughout the Middle East, and even into Central Asia. Islamic law based off of the Quran or Sharia was going to develop, and this was going to unite the peoples of this vast realm. The Arabs themselves in certain areas would become admirers and would become preservers of some of the Western tradition. So, for instance, Greek philosophy was preserved and expanded. Muslim science became the premier science of the ancient world, of the early medieval world, I should say. So Muslim doctors and astronomers became the best in the world. Cities like Baghdad, Damascus, and Cordoba became great intellectual centers and some of the largest cities in the world. And Islamic civilization, after all, Muhammad had been a merchant, became a great trading civilization. Trade links connected Spain to all the way to India and China. And so the Muslim world was economically very vibrant as well. And so by the 700s, the Islamic civilization was already pretty well established. And so if we consider this period of time between about 300 to about 700 AD, some pretty profound changes had occurred. The Mediterranean, which had long been a Roman lake, had largely been the center of the Roman Empire, was now divided among 3 different civilizations. Muslim naval domination in the Mediterranean was nearly absolute, except around the area around Constantinople. And this was going to have a profound effect on the Latin West. One Islamic ruler boasted that the Christians could not float a plank upon the sea. In other words, Christians were largely cut off, at least Western Christians were largely cut off from the Mediterranean, which would mean that they weren't going to be linked by trade. And this, more than anything, was going to really begin to isolate and ruralize the Latin West and usher in the Middle Ages more than anything. The Latin West itself was going to grow increasingly fragmented and rural, and was only going to be stabilized by the church. It was going to be cut off not only from trade, but also intellectual life, as Islamic dominance was going to be near absolute. As a result, the West would turn inward, developing into feudalism and local economies eventually. Meanwhile, the Greek East, Roman institutions survived, but in a new Greek form. But it too was weakened not only by the rise of Islamic civilization, but increasing pressure by barbarian tribes. And it was going to be vulnerable to Islamic attacks as well. Meanwhile, the Islamic Caliphate were going to be the main beneficiaries. They were going to be inherit the most Roman territory and also Persian territory. They were going to dominate Mediterranean and geopolitical trade. They were going to be united, at least initially, by their new religion and Sharia law, and were going to become the intellectual leaders during this period of time. One area that is an interesting area that we'll conclude with is Spain, or as it became known in Islamic times, Al-Andalusia. And this became a type of crossroads, a frontier between the Christians to the north and the Muslims to the south. And so in some ways, this was a place where there could be a cultural exchange. So the civilization that's going to develop in Spain is going to be very vibrant and very rich, influenced by Roman and Byzantine and Islamic traditions. Great scholars are going to live in Spain, translating Greek works and Islamic works into different languages. But it's also going to be a hot spot. Several minor Christian kingdoms are going to survive in the north, and of course, the rest of Christian Europe is going to be there. And Muslim armies are going to attempt to extend the jihad deeper into Europe, where they are going to meet some Christian resistance. Eventually, by the way, this battle between Christians and Muslims will be known as the Reconquista by the Spaniards, but that's a few centuries away. A very significant confrontation occurred in 732 when the Muslim prince or emir of Spain, a man by the name of Abd al-Rahman al-Gaddafi, led his forces out of Spain in a bid to extend the caliphate deeper into France. He was met by a local Frankish ruler by the name of Charles Martel. And outside of Paris, around the city of Tours, Charles Martel dealt a devastating blow to al-Gaddafi and largely stopped further Islamic expansion into France. This is notable for a few reasons because, one, this was the first major defeat inflicted on Islamic forces. Two, it was also noteworthy because this would largely stop further Muslim expansion into Northern Europe. There would be border excursions and half-hearted attempts, but this was really set the boundaries between the two regions. And lastly, it's significant because Charles Martel would cement his status and go on to become the ruler of the Franks. And the Franks are going to become the main focus of our next lecture. Once a minor Germanic tribe, they now were a rising power. In our next lecture, we're going to see the greatest of the Frankish and medieval kings, really, Charles the Great, or Charlemagne, as he's sometimes called, emerge to unify the Western Empire, what had been the Western Empire, into the Holy Roman Empire. And we're going to see how the Franks go from tribal warriors to the most powerful rulers in Western Europe. We'll see how church and state alliances begin to be formed and how Charlemagne is going to attempt to create a new Roman Empire. Stay tuned.